Good morning to my panelists and welcome everybody. We're going to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to questions from our audience. So Dr. Ken Ginsburg, Dr. Joanna Lee Williams, thank you both for talking with me. Dr. Lee Williams, may I begin with you? Because I want to talk about how we think about and even talk about our teens. I have my PhD only in that I have 4 teenagers, but even I, a minute ago, was making a joke and the punchline was, oh, they're so difficult. Oh, it's so hard. Oh, it's survival. And only did I sort of, when I was kind of called out in it, I realized like, oh, wow, even though I'm kidding, that's a narrative that I continually go back to in my life. See, get it? Haha, it's a joke. It's funny. Talk to me about how teens are perceived and the impact of how you frame them, why that matters.
Okay. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I always welcome an opportunity to talk about teens and really adolescence more broadly. So I think you just named some of the ways in which we often hear adolescence being framed. What I want to begin with actually is how we should be talking about adolescence. So for me, what's really exciting about adolescence is that it's a period of opportunity and exploration and discovery and promise. So as we think about, all of the changes that are happening in adolescence, what comes with that is a lot of opportunity for, creativity and innovation, learning and developing skills related to, how to build healthy relationships, how to kind of explore the world and think about issues of justice. And probably most central are questions related to identity. So, who am I? How do other people see me? Who do I want to be in the world? When we think about adolescent development, that's the frame that I think is the important one to really center, because then that leads to really thinking about how then should we be structuring, relationships within families or experiences in schools and other institutions that kind of promote all of the possibilities of adolescence. So I want to push that frame as a frame of opportunity that's really rooted in the science of adolescent development. It's not one that I think is just some sort of, superficial narrative. It's one that's grounded in what we know about adolescents developing bodies, they're developing brains, they're developing capacities.
And I love when people push a frame and talk about like, hey, let's change how you're speaking about something and framing something. Like it's easy to undo it. Because I think the way I frame it is the way a lot of parents frame it, right? Dr. Ginsburg, if you would, talk to me a little bit about what's happening developmentally. So we know psychologically, a lot of what they're thinking about constantly is, where is my place in this world? What is my identity? What's my role in this? What's literally happening sort of biologically that's going on with that?
So let's back up for a minute because this all ties together. The reason we have to change the frame of how we think about teens is because we create a script in our head. And when we create a script in our head, it drives our thoughts, which drives our actions. And our thoughts and our actions create a different kind of relationship with our kids. So we're either seeing this as a time of potential, as an astounding, if not breathtaking opportunity, or we're looking at this as a time to survive. And why did I go backwards when you asked a question about what was happening in a child's head? Because what's happening in a child's head as they move into adolescence is this astounding developmental place where they begin to feel deeply emotional, where connections and relationships matter so much, and where they can literally feel what you are feeling. Right? It's why when you look at one of your kids and you go like this, they're like, why do you hate me? Right? their brains are on fire, right? The emotional part of their brains are becoming brilliant. They are sensitive. They are nuanced. They are looking for the kind of relationships that will change with their family so they can grow up. They're looking for the kind of relationships that will develop with peers so that they'll be able to get jobs, form communities, have romantic relationships, ultimately give us grandchildren, right? So their brains are literally evolving so that their emotional selves are becoming brilliant. And their thinking selves are changing in a breathtaking way. A child sees things as they are. This is the way they are. I see it, it's concrete. An adolescent begins to see possibility, nuance, complexity. That's why they're so idealistic, because their brains are developing and seeing things more complexly. And that is why they're our bridge to a positive shared future, because they can change things if we set them up to do so.
Joanna, if I may call you that, let's talk specifically about kids of color, because I know you sort of specialize in that. Talk to me a little bit about where you see additional either opportunities, challenges with kids of color in how they're perceived in that quest for identity, in that brilliance that's being developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think as adolescents, we all, again, are centering questions around identity and figuring out who we are. And of course, that happens in the context that we encounter from day to day. So we need to think carefully about the kinds of messages that young people are receiving. Youth of color, so particularly from racially and ethnically minoritized backgrounds, are often receiving messages, one in which race become racialized by others. And so they, in questions related to identity, if you're often receiving messages that, I see you through a racial lens, then questions about how race fits into your identity may become more central and more salient. Also, I think thinking about aspects of identity related to race or ethnicity or culture become a real source of strength for adolescents of color. So if you can think about your heritage culture as a source of strength and pride, that gives you a strong foundation for thinking about who you are and figuring out your position. So in some ways, there's a little bit of tension because we live in a stratified society, and there are issues related to power. There's issues related to access to resources, and of course, loads of negative stereotypes. Developmentally, youth of color are going through the same kinds of normative processes that all youth are going through that Ken and I will continue to talk about. But when you're doing that in a context in which race is made salient to you, over and over again, it may be something that you then think about relative to white youth about incorporating into your identity. And we know that there's great power and promise in having a strong sense of who you are from a racial or ethnic standpoint. That again becomes this important foundation for building relationships, thinking about how can I now give back and sort of honor the heritage of the groups that I come from. So it's a source of strength. And I think the challenging narrative comes not from adolescents themselves, but it comes from sort of these societal messages that they are often navigating.
Interesting. So how do you think, Ken, if I can call you that, about the tools to equip adolescents, teenagers with, as they're navigating these very complicated conversations at times about race, about really every single thing that I think everyone is dealing with, especially today in a pandemic, which we're going to get to more in a moment. How do you think about meaning and connection around complicated questions for teenagers?
The first thing we need to do as young people are going to navigate complicated questions is to have them do it from a place of security and a place of safety and a place of pride. And so let's be clear that comes from family and community. When other people are challenging who you are, whether you're good enough, whether you're different, whether it's traditional bullying or whether it's racism, you're receiving a message that is undermining, that is destructive. And what you need to be able to refute that message is to have a firm grounding in your excellence. And that is one of the reasons that parents are so important. When parents love without condition, when parents make it really clear that I know who you are, I see who you are, and I stand by you unwaveringly and without condition, then a young person can develop the tools to confront a more challenging world. Beyond our family comes community and racial and ethnic and community pride that says we have so much to contribute and we already have. And when you know that, then you're able to begin to withstand external pressures, And Soledad, if I can say one more thing, when we talk about race and racism, it's so important that we support our youth of color, but this is not a conversation we should exclude white youth from. As long as there is oppression, as long as there are forces that prevent a person from being their best selves, as long as there are barriers to true equity, then nobody is their authentic self. Then nobody is their best self. We have to really be aspirational here when it comes to racial identity, racial pride, and moving towards a world with equity. And we've got to leverage who adolescents are. Adolescents get this. They get this. Talk to them about it. Talk to your kids. Talk to kids on the street. They get injustice and they want to fix it.
Yeah, I would say they get it very deeply, sometimes better than their parents.
Yes.
So we can't ignore where we find ourselves today, right? Which is, I think, I'll use my teenage twin boys as an example. They're 16, and because their identity is very wrapped up in sports and extracurriculars and school and friends at school, it's a struggle. It has been a bit of a struggle for them because those things either exist sporadically if you're lucky or just don't exist at all as we are making our way through this pandemic. What's been some of the advice that you're giving parents and teenagers as well about how to navigate that? I have found that they turn to their electronics to keep those friendships. I'm not sure if that's good or if that's bad, but I know that things aren't normal right now. Joanna, why don't you start that off for me? And then Ken, if you would, I'd love you to jump in on that too.
So I think what is the important part of what you shared about your twin boys is that they have a need to continue sort of being connected to their peers. And that's really important because that's, it's a key part of adolescent development. Adolescents are learning all sorts of complex skills about how to be in relationships through their friends. They're getting, messages that support who they are and all sorts of affirmation, opportunity to practice resolving conflict. So peer relationships are really important. I think technology then becomes a tool. So I think whether, it's not necessarily that the technology is good or bad, but if it is the one sort of point of access to a peer relationship. The peer relationship is the important ingredient when we're talking about adolescent development. I say that knowing that Ken will probably follow up and, remind us how important adult relationships are too. So I'm not going to minimize those. But the point that I want to make is technology becomes a tool that, we are all forced to be using in order to maintain social connections. So it's not necessarily, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think the important thing is that adolescents, they're continuing to develop throughout the pandemic. Social development is still happening. All of their needs to explore and to kind of try new ways of learning and becoming, those haven't gone away just because, lots of things have shut down. So we need to create those kinds of opportunities. And again, technology is one way that we're able to do that.
Yeah, so I agree strongly with everything that Joanna said. But I think we also can move back a step and say, why is the challenge to relationships particularly hard to adolescents, right? We know there's a lot been in the news about increasing rates of anxiety and depression with adolescents. That is true. We must address it without a doubt. But we also have to be deeply empathetic so that we understand why specifically this pandemic is a challenge to adolescents, lest we paint a picture of brokenness which is going to hurt our kids. So there are two things to remember. And again, we're going to go back to brain development, right? So there's what are adolescents supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be expanding their boundaries, testing their limits, because they're super learners. They're learning all the time. So they should be stretching and challenging. What has the pandemic done? Stay here. So literally, of course, it's harder for adolescents. What else is happening? Their brains are literally wired. They have reward centers in their brain that go like when they're with friends because they're wired to have joy, to experience exuberance with their friends. And what is the pandemic doing? It's a crisis of isolation and human connection. Of course, it's harder for the adolescents. So rather than painting a picture of brokenness, let's begin building the solutions. Let's begin understanding how imperative it is to create connections wherever we can. And that's going to include in technology, or that's going to include on the back porch separated by 6 feet, right? But whatever it is, what we can't do to our kids is say, just sit still. I'm doing it, you're doing it. What problems do you have? I'm the one who has to pay the bills. If we don't understand the developmental context and celebrate and elevate their incredible capacity to form relationships and maintain them however they can, of course, they're going to have problems.
So we're back to this narrative conversation, and you talk about a narrative of brokenness, which I think we are firmly in, right? I mean, you just have to look at headlines, and they're talking about quarantines or the lost years, and I think that, you know, the driving narrative, it's a disaster. The kids are far behind and struggling, and it's horrible. I'm curious how you guys think about, one, changing that narrative, but also, are there some pieces of that narrative that are accurate? And how do you navigate keeping the things that are factually accurate without driving down the black hole of a narrative that seems to suck everybody in? I wouldn't say my kids have had a lost year, but they've had a lot of good opportunities and access, certainly. So I'm always I struggle to figure out like how to name it and be accurate. Ken, why don't you start, and then Joanna will go to you.
Thanks, because I've been doing this work for 35 years, and I live on changing narrative, you know, because I work with youth enduring homelessness, and I've been doing this for 35 years. And so many people judge those youth and assume that they're nothing but storm and stress, trouble and turmoil. And what I have learned is that when I can make those youth or support those youth to feel safe, they are the most deeply compassionate and loving human beings on the planet. So when someone gives me an opportunity to talk about narrative, I'm ready to explode. So here goes. Yes, there is a problem right now, undoubtedly. And what we don't want to do by framing a new positive narrative is ignore the fact that kids are in trouble. So we surround the kids with support, we look for the young people who are in trouble, and we work towards healing. But as a society, I'm going to tell you that I believe if the adults play their cards right, the seeds of the greatest generation ever exist right now. Let me tell you why, or try to build this case. Every generation has a moment, usually during their adolescence, which define how they view the world, how they see themselves, how they parent, even how they grandparent. Every generation has a moment. Think about like the Depression era kids. They knew how to stretch resources to the limits. This generation of kids right now, for all the reasons that we can't stand, right? They have an environmental existential crisis. They thankfully are waking up to social justice and equity and hopefully bringing us along, but they are also experiencing this crisis of connection, right? Of isolation. So now imagine what's going to happen as the pandemic begins getting better. Imagine now what's going to happen when they are with their friends again, learning in school. Their appreciation for discourse and discussion will go through the roof. Kids have been using like this for like the last decade. It looks like this. You know how many kids are going to want to throw this out the window now when they can be with a friend? What's it going to be like when they can worship together? What's it going to be like when they can be on teams together? Gosh, Soledad, what's it going to be like when they can hug their grandparents again? Our date is March 30th, and we get to see my mother-in-law, 96 years old, for the first time in a year. What's it going to be like for my kids when they can hug their grandma again? What that means is that this is a real opportunity. I believe deeply in my soul that the seeds are in place for this generation to care about human connection, to fight for justice, to venerate the elderly, but to understand the power of human connection. If this is what this generation is imprinted with, the power of togetherness, of family, of community, of conversation. If this generation walks away, I'm almost done. If this generation walks away,
keep going. We're loving it.
I can't stop myself, probably. If this generation understands that as individuals, we're fragile like a stick, we can be vulnerable, we can break in the wind. When we join in solidarity with another human being, harder to bend. When we join in community, impossible to break. In fact, in community, like the bundle of sticks, we are stronger than the sum of our individual parts. That has something to do with physics and everything to do with spirituality, right? But if this generation can walk away knowing that together we are stronger, together we can solve problems, together I have the ability to be vulnerable and to still be okay. I believe that we can pull this off, and I believe this could be the coolest generation ever.
Joanna, a lot of what Ken is saying is around community. And when we turn back to kids of color, I look at the community being amazingly supportive often, but also having taken an incredibly tough hit during this pandemic, both from the disease itself and also economically. And so I wonder if there is a community around some of these kids, maybe especially kids of color, that's a little exhausted, that would love to be there fully supporting, but they've got some challenges that they're dealing with. How do you see it, Joanna?
Sure. I think it's important to recognize that there have been inequitable impacts of the pandemic, and that historically marginalized communities have had negative impacts. But I also think it's important to put that in historical context and think about historically marginalized communities as having a history of building adaptive cultures and centering on ways of, in the context of racism and oppression, of thinking about how they are going to thrive. And so I think it's important to recognize, without minimizing, without minimizing challenges, it's important to recognize capacity for thriving that exists within communities. And to recognize that looks and it looks and appears in a really diverse set of ways that we might not always recognize. I heard we were doing a focus group conversation with Black parents of Black teenagers recently, and I was just so really captivated by a mom who was talking about her teenage son, 18-year-old African-American male who's often sort of, seen through the lens of stereotypes and single stories about Blackness and maleness and the intersections of those. But what she was celebrating as a Black mom was her son drawing upon his heritage culture to think about serving the community in a time of need. And so he was starting his own nonprofit related to feeding and supporting people in his community experiencing homelessness. And she shared stories about how she would take walks with him and watch him greet homeless people on the street as brother and sister, and say good morning to them and sort of humanize them. And for me, that's sort of that's the capacity that adolescents, including adolescents of color, have. And it was rooted in community strength and community resilience. Of course, again, I don't want to minimize issues of equity. I think to Ken's point, this also becomes an opportunity for us to think about how we can really lean into system level change when we realize that systems are not serving all adolescents well. This becomes an opportunity for thinking about how do we change our systems in order to promote equitable experiences and opportunities. One of the reasons that's particularly important in adolescence is because adolescence is a time where there's great opportunity for change as well. What we know about the science of adolescent development is that if we intervene in ways that promote thriving and supports, trajectories can change for the better. Oftentimes, I think we make the mistake of thinking that early childhood is a time when we need to sort of intervene because, their kids are most sort of flexible. But we know that there's this second really important window in adolescence where we can provide these important supports and resources and change trajectories for the better.
I love seeing that story of the young man sort of seeing opportunity in being able to help in the context of like, it's a very bad time for a lot of people. So this is actually an opportunity to use what you have. There's a similar statistic around the number of Black students who are applying to medical school. I think it's up almost 30%, which, I mean, what an amazing, right? The narrative could be, oh my God, coronavirus decimating Black and brown communities, or it could be what has driven, the number of students who've decided they want to serve their communities by being doctors. It is the same exact thing. So I'm really curious about what we're getting wrong in terms of kids and their ability to cope in these times. I think a lot of parents, and maybe Ken, I'll have you start with this, want to wrap their kids like in bubble wrap, and if they can, and protect them, and worry that they're overstressed or that they are not having the relationships that they usually would have with the teachers, with their friends in person. What do we get wrong about how kids are able to cope?
Right. So I think if given the choice when my kids were teenagers, if there was bubble wrap big enough and permanent enough, I probably would have put it on them, but it's not possible, right? So the only thing that is possible is to prepare them for the world. And coping and stress management strategies are really key. Why? Because you can't protect them from things that are difficult. You just can't. The way you deal with things that are difficult is called coping. And there's positive ways of coping and there's negative ways of coping. And the negative ways of coping are unfortunately the quick and easy fixes. Things like drugs, things like punching someone, things like being in an unhealthy relationship. They're quick and easy and they destroy you. So what we need to do when we're thinking about coping is first, never forget that the most important thing that allows your child to be able to cope and make wise choices is that deep, loving connection. That's the most important part of coping. Then we have many, many strategies that we know will help young people to cope. We need their bodies to be strong, which means we have to think about their exercise, their nutrition, their sleep, their relaxation. We have to help them problem solve in all of these different kinds of strategies that involve tackling some problems and avoiding others. We have to help them know how to manage their emotions, sometimes by getting away from them, just taking a little vacation, and sometimes by expressing how you feel. And then the one that you were talking about before, we have to be able to help young people know how much they matter. When human beings know how much they matter, then they can withstand so much stress. Soledad, it so happens to be that on the Center for Parent and Teen Communication, we extensively teach parents about how to help their child manage stress in their life. And we actually have a fully interactive plan that teaches young people how to do it themselves. So it's hugely important in terms of preparation for life, because you can't prevent the stress, but if you can teach a kid how to manage it, they're going to always be healthier. Like when they're old, they're going to be healthier because stress is going to keep coming.
I love that, because I was going to ask next, what should parents do? But it sounds like a really good piece of advice would be go to check out the website and get some real strategies, because of course, we would love to wrap our kids in bubble wrap, but it actually probably would be worse than helping them learn how to navigate some crises and become stronger and better. What do you think we're getting wrong, Joanna, about what our kids are capable of? As I feel, they just announced that in New York City, they're going to start giving the vaccine to anybody age 50 and up, which, they're starting to reach these new milestones of populations that they're covering. And it feels, in New York at least, like, okay, we're reaching another level of the beginning of this thing ending. What do you think we get wrong in terms of kids' ability to cope? And what advice do you give, Joanna, as we kind of move out of this pandemic?
So I think, again, going back to the idea of there is opportunity to promote thriving during adolescence. It's not a period where, they're old enough that we can't intervene anymore. I think it's important to remember that adolescents are still developing. And so, creating environments that support that development in healthy ways is really critical. I think remembering, and this is just sort of seconding some of the things that Ken just shared, that adolescents need adults in their lives, and that, sort of adolescent development is rooted in strong relationships, means that, in order to support coping, for example, they need guidance on how to do that. I think we need to pair, sort of opportunities and capabilities around leadership and autonomy with scaffolding and kind of guideposts for how to do that. The bubble wrap idea, I think, again, while I sort of understand it, if we think about if we did that, then, what would happen to adolescents when they were adults? Would they have these skills? So I think realizing that adult relationships are still critical, and that's parents, that's also other caring adults in their lives, become really critical supports for adolescents. I think we can't forget that or minimize that as an important part of the story. The other part that I often, when I have the chance to center this, is that adolescents are developing, these amazing minds and amazing capabilities. So we need to ask them, centering their voices in thinking about, what they feel they need is critical, and also what they feel some of the solutions should be is also really critical. The adolescents as super learners, as we understand those developing capabilities, means they can think outside of the box in ways that adults are often sort of fixed and, are not necessarily thinking about, sort of innovative ideas. So I think we need to center their voices as we think about, what are they seeing as their challenges and what do they identify as potential solutions.
I love that. I think that's some of the greatest advice. I want to head right back to Morra because I know I'm watching the Q&A and the chat portion grow exponentially, and it's making me anxious because I know there's lots of questions and lots of comments, and I want to make sure we get to all of them. So Morra, let me send this right back to you.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go up to, I had my question, and there's so much conversation in the chat, but I'm going to actually put you on the spot with one of the questions, and you as well, Soledad, as a journalist, because Dr. Hina Talib has a wonderful question here, where she says that the narrative of brokenness among teenagers lacks equity, and it is so dismissive and single-minded. And I want to know from Joanna, from Ken, and you, Soledad, what's the alternative headline besides quarantines and the lost year and this brokenness narrative? What words and what stories can people tell?
I can answer in a line. Joanna's student who's running around helping homeless people, in an environment where we could have done a woe is me about, I'm sure, that young man, and I'm sure he has family members who are struggling, and I'm sure his parents could tell us what they're dealing with. And I'm going to guess if he's a young African-American man, there's family members who have died from coronavirus or have gotten sick from coronavirus at the very least, right? So we certainly could do the litany of all of that, or we could say, freed up from daily classes, teenager finds time to invest in the homeless in his town. And by the way, that would be an awesome story. It's why I think this idea of narrative change is so important. It sort of forces people like, stop looking this way, start looking this way, and now tell me what you see.
I agree. I think there are those kind of stories that are about, youth starting nonprofits. And then there's sort of the everyday kinds of stories about ways in which youth are engaging in their communities and their schools, that if those were centered more, I think that would, help to shift the narrative rather than, centering the things that are about, risk-taking or problems or, crises. So I think centering narratives that sort of are grounded in the reality of adolescent capabilities and promise are important. And when it comes to equity, I think representation of people in all of their, sort of the range of diversity becomes critical. And I don't mean that in a kind of optics way that you sometimes show a person of color or something like that, but I think understanding that communities are diverse, all communities have strengths, and adolescents are part of those communities becomes really important as well.
And I would add, adolescents are the future of those communities, right? They're the part of the communities now, but the future tomorrow. And, you know, I don't know if this is a news story or not. I'm not a journalist, but I'd love people to begin talking about turning the camera around and looking at the adults and saying, what are the adolescents seeing right now, right? Adolescents are trying to figure out how to be healthy 35, 40, and 50-year-olds. What are we showing them right now? What's the example that you're creating for them right now? And I have to say that, you know, I love being aspirational and positive, but I think we also have to understand that when I was talking about the possibility of this time imprinting this generation with a real commitment to human relationships and togetherness, I think we have to ask ourselves starkly, is this what we're talking about? Or in fact, is most of the narrative in this country about divisiveness? Because I think we have to be honest that we are not behaving well, and we are not good models for this moment. When we should be reinforcing togetherness and community, we are not always doing that. And while that may not be a story, it certainly is the conversation we need to have.
I have a very specific question, but I think it's a wonderful one from Liz Vaccarello. What tools can we give a teenager who is her peer group's empath? A 16-year-old girl whose friends share and open up to her about their traumas, their disorders, their worries. She knows to tell me, her parent, about anything she can't deal with, cutting, eating disorders, but she is taking on so much of that emotional stress.
So, Joanna, may I attempt to jump in there? So first off, congratulations for having a child who is so loving. That child is destined to be an amazing adult, but that child has an incredible breadth and depth of feeling and will experience more pain in the journey towards adulthood because they're absorbing other people's pain. So the lesson you want them to begin to learn now is that you are blessed with a gift, but the only way you can take care of other people is if you learn to take care of yourselves. Otherwise, you will run out of energy and not be good for anybody. If this adolescent learns this now, this adolescent will continue to be an empath when she's 120 years old. And she'll be a great psychologist or doctor or whatever it is she chooses to be. But this is an opportunity for us parents to say, I love who you are, and I care that you take care of yourself. The other major thing that she has to learn right now is boundaries. And I was pleased to hear that she shares her when she's over her head with her parent, but all professionals, including this guy, has boundaries and limits where I know that we are beyond what I am capable of. So she needs to learn, ideally in a strength-based way, how to get the young person she's supporting to know that it's an act of complete strength to go to an adult who knows how to support her. And it just so happens to be that on parentandteen.com, the article that specifically, Eden, if you can put it on the chat, that is about guiding your kids towards professional help is all the strength-based language a human being needs to know that seeking help is an act of tremendous strength, not limitation. And I'd love your empathetic daughter or empathic daughter to have that language down so she can apply reasonable limits.
Soledad, Joanna, want to add in, or thank you, Ken, that was great.
You know, the only thing I would add, and I'm not sure I was ever an empath, but I do think reporters sometimes fill a similar role, right? You become a vessel for a lot of stuff, and that's your job. And so you take it. And so I think a parent helping their daughter now figure out how to navigate that will help her in her lifelong mission of whatever her job ends up being. Because I think sometimes when you're framed as the generous person or the empath, or, you know, it's very easy to be like, well, I'm the empath, so I've got to keep doing this, versus like, it's okay to say, not today. I can't hear it today. Like let's schedule this for tomorrow. Wow, that sounds really terrible. I definitely want to hear about it. How about tomorrow at 5 o'clock? Because otherwise, I think I found as a reporter, it just was very easy to get overwhelmed. And people would stop you in the street to tell you their story. And could you cover it? And their cousin is in prison. And could you help them? And you get to the point where you're drowning in so much stuff and you actually do want to be helpful. But when you're drowning, you're not helpful to anybody. And so I think Ken is exactly right. Getting the parents to help her with that early will save her from doing it when she's 35. And the company empath for everybody and really struggling because she hasn't figured out how to manage that.
Boundaries. Thank you, Soledad. Okay, here's a great question from Adiba Nelson. When our kids are going through this emotional development and emotions are on high 24/7, how do we help our tweens and teens determine not only the root of what the emotions are, but also, do those deep emotions fit the issue, i.e. emotional regulation, without invalidating them?
Joanna, do you have an answer? If not, I'll jump in.
You can jump in, Ken. I'll follow up.
Okay. So the important thing to remember is that when the emotional part of the brain is dominating, then it's very hard to come up with rational thoughts and decision making. So think about it. If a tiger is attacking you, you're not supposed to turn to the tiger and say, I'd like to work this out. And you're also not supposed to turn to the tiger and say, help me understand why you want to eat me, right? You're only on fire. So in order to activate the thinking and decision-making part of the brain, we have to help kids learn to regulate. And we do this through co-regulation, right? What is co-regulation? You're on an airplane, there's turbulence. You don't look at the guy next to you with white knuckles. You look at the flight attendant. If she's still or they're still serving snack mix, you're cool. We co-regulate with our kids. Like the duck on the water gliding, but staying afloat only because we can share how our little feet are paddling underneath. We co-regulate with our kids, but also we talk to the correct part of their brain. In other words, if their brilliant emotional part is going off and you respond not calmly, you respond with a lecture or with condescending tone, or you just get super emotional yourself, that kid's amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, will hijack the rest, and there's no way they can problem solve. You're being calm, caring, loving, reflective, and to make sure that they know that they're safe gets the emotional part of their brain calm. And then the thinking part of their brain in a state of calm works as well as it does in an adult, when we know how to co-regulate and we know how to communicate.
What I'll add to that quickly is that it takes practice. It takes practice. And just as adolescents are learning these skills, parents of adolescents also, are learning these skills as well. So I think context does matter, as Ken said. There are some moments in which our adolescents, as adolescents, we are sort of highly activated and are, sort of the way our brains are developing, play a role in that. So I think attending to the moments and context, and also as a parent, being sort of open enough to realize that sometimes you're not always going to have the wherewithal to have that sort of calm response, or to kind of wait out until your teen is in a place where, they can sort of hear or engage with you in a conversation that feels more rational. I think being forgiving with yourself too is important. So know that it does take some practice.
I found it passes too. My daughter, Cecilia, was convinced that she had Ebola when the Ebola crisis. I mean, convinced that she had Ebola, in hysterics every night, crying that she had Ebola. And now, 5, 6, 7 years later, she can laugh about how over the top her response was. But at the time, we had to treat it like it was truly as she was seeing it, very intense terror about a thing that we knew was not a possibility considering how she traveled, et cetera, et cetera. But they grow out of it is sometimes good advice too for parents.
This is the last question. I think it's a great one to end on. So if any of you want to add a final thought in with an answer, go for it. This is from Kiana Agbai, who says, I appreciate the concept of adolescence as a bridge to possibility. And I'd like to engage my teen by explaining that this is happening without being condescending. Is there a creative way to do this? And then she also asks, are there other people besides parents that we can draw in to help teens realize their potential and engage in community?
Yes. So I'm going to start with the other people first. I've had the opportunity, as a professor to teach adolescent development to pre-service teachers. So young adults who are training to teach in middle schools and high schools. And when I, sort of present this frame of adolescence as opportunity, they get so excited about, becoming teachers in middle schools and high schools. I remember a couple of years back having a student in my class saying, like, why didn't I know this before? She was sort of getting riled up, like, I wish I always had this frame. And she was so excited to think about, her role in collaborating with the students in her classroom. So I think we can think about educators in the field of youth development. So youth development programs that are often community-based. Youth development staff have known this and have been doing this now for decades. And I think, the research community is finally catching up. But in those kinds of settings, it's sort of assumed that youth have these capacities, and then they're put in positions where they can demonstrate their leadership. They can demonstrate their skills at asking questions and working on solving problems in novel ways, contributing to their communities. So I think those kinds of adults have this, there's never any doubt about the capabilities of adolescents. I've also found, the last thing that I'll say, that in conversations with adolescents, just like with all of us, having information that helps us reflect on who we are often does provide us with a sense of possibility. So I think those conversations can be had, whether or not. So I don't know that, adolescents themselves are reflecting in this way on a period in which they are in the middle of. But I do think having conversations with young people about their goals and their aspirations and their values, their future selves, is a way of helping to kind of contextualize and make concrete some of these possibilities too.
Absolutely, I agree with everything that Joanna said. I would just add the caution of, when we talk to young people, it's okay to talk about both the present and the future. Because when we're always talking about future and meaning and purpose and these big lofty words, sometimes it's just too much pressure, right? So it's really okay to ask kids what they think about now, right? Even as we keep our frame towards the future. I'll tell you, I was keynoting a conference on Saturday morning, and then we were having Zoom questions afterwards. And there was it was a pediatrician said that her 11-year-old son was watching with her and said, wow, this guy knows teenagers. He should teach us. Right? So kids actually do love learning about how they think and all of their potential. And I actually think it's kind of a nice place of safety away from the messages that are so undermining for them. If we can teach about adolescence the way Joanna Lee Williams does, right, about possibility and potential, then kids are going to celebrate the stage of life they're in. And that's our goal.
I'm going to give you the last word, Soledad.
Oh, goodness. You should not at all, because I feel like I'm only wrapping the experts, but I am going to take the prerogative to underscore something that you've said, which I do think is the purview of media and everybody else, right? It's that narrative. It's that narrative change. And you guys, even before we started, really gave me the lesson on how you speak about things and how you talk about them and how you frame them really does matter. It's not a joke. It's not a punchline. It's not being sassy as you chat. Your words and your framing make a big difference. And I think that's a really good place for everybody to start, right? Just like from this moment forward, we can all do that. And then I would just encourage you, as you see stories that you don't like or you think are framed poorly, reach out to the writer and tell them, do better. These things can be framed differently. I spend my life yelling at people on Twitter about framing better. It can be very effective. Thanks for having me, and what an amazing conversation. I truly appreciate it. I see that there's going to be a transcript of this entire conversation as well for anybody who's been struggling to take notes. Don't do that. Stop taking notes. It'll be made available to you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Joanna. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time and energy.
Yeah, my pleasure too. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That was fabulous. And please sign up for our KOL email list for more fabulous events like this. We will put it in the chat, and stay safe and enjoy the day. Bye.